During this lecture, I'd like to take a look at the Jacksonian era of American history, and we're going to pick up following the War of 1812. Immediately after the War of 1812, British products were sold at prices far below the cost of American-made merchandise here in the United States. Consequently, very few Americans bought American goods. Placing a tariff on imports would increase the cost of foreign goods, thus eliminating their price advantage. Tariff revenues would also pay for internal improvements that were desperately needed in the country at that time. President James Madison proposed the tariff of 1816, excuse me, and while Northeasterners welcomed such protective tariffs because their economy was based largely on manufacture, those in the South and West did not because their economy was more agrarian and they relied on manufactured goods from other places. The tariff of 1816 most benefited American manufacturers. While people were divided over protective tariffs, most supported a national bank. And the second bank of the United States would make available currency guaranteed to be accepted nationwide. This bank was chartered by Congress for a 20-year period beginning in 1816. Also in 1816, James Monroe was elected president. He went on a goodwill tour of New England and was welcomed in Boston, which at one time had been a Federalist stronghold. People seemed pleased with the way the country was developing, and this time became known as the era of good feelings. The Supreme Court boosted national power. One of the cases that it undertook was Gibbons v. Ogden. The Chief Justice at this time was Chief Justice John Marshall. In 1808, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston received a charter from New York to grant exclusive rights to run steamboats on New York rivers. This granted them a monopoly, an exclusive legal control of a commercial activity. Other steamboat operators had to be licensed by Fulton and Livingston. Aaron Ogden sued Thomas Gibbons over steamboat operations on the Hudson River. And in 1824, the Supreme Court ruled that interstate commerce could be regulated by the federal government. In other words, Ogden's exclusive right, granted by the state of New York, was not legal since his route crossed state lines. More importantly, in clarifying that Congress had authority over interstate commerce, they ensured that the federal government has the right to regulate just about anything that crosses state lines. Another landmark case that we see during this period of time is the case of McCulloch v. Maryland. In 1819, Maryland levied a heavy tax on the local branch of the Bank of the United States, hoping to make it fail. Marshall declared that if this were to be allowed to happen, states would, in effect, be overturning laws passed by Congress. So Marshall denied the right of Maryland to tax the bank. This upholds the supremacy clause of the Constitution and strengthened federal government and its control over the economy. The Bank of the United States is upheld under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, as it was necessary and proper for the federal government to charter the Bank of the United States in order to carry out its responsibility to coin and regulate money. During this period of time, nationalism shaped foreign policy. Working under President James Monroe, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams established a foreign policy guided by nationalism, the belief that national interest should be placed ahead of regional concerns or the interest of other countries. Adams prioritized the security of the nation and the expansion of its territory. In 1819, we see the Adams-Onis Treaty. Spain was too weak to hold its interest in North America, so Spain ceded Florida to the U.S. in the Adams-Onis Treaty, and Spain also gave up its claim to the Oregon Territory. In 1823, Spain and Portugal defeated Napoleon. That defeat actually occurred in 1815, and they wanted to reclaim former colonies in Latin America. Russia had been interested in Alaska and actually had settlements in Alaska since 1784, also began establishing trading posts in Northern California. Spain's actions interfered with American interest in Mexico and Cuba, and Russia's actions interfered with American trade with China. In his 1823 message to Congress, President Monroe warned all outside powers not to interfere in affairs in the Western Hemisphere. They should not attempt to create new colonies or overthrow newly independent republics. The U.S. would consider such actions dangerous to our peace and safety. At the same time, the United States, Monroe, promised that the United States would not involve itself in European affairs, and this became known as the Monroe Doctrine. One of the largest pieces of legislation that we see during this period in terms of the United States Congress was the Missouri Compromise. Nationalism also pushed Americans west. When a territory's population reached 60,000, they could petition the Union for admission, draft a constitution, elect representatives, and become part of the United States. So in 1819, settlers in Missouri requested admission to the Union, but a new problem arose: slavery. In 1818, Congress admits Illinois as the 11th free state. Southerners expected Missouri to be entered as the 11th slave state. New York Congressman James Talmadge amended Missouri's statehood bill to require Missouri to gradually free its slaves. The bill passes in the House of Representatives. Southerners perceived this as a threat to their power and blocked the Missouri bill in the Senate, because you see, if Missouri came in as a slave state, 11 free states, 11 slave states, but then eventually they were required to free their slaves, it would upset the balance of power in Congress. As the arguments raged, Alabama was admitted as the 11th slave state to the Union. Missouri's status now became crucial, as it would tip the balance of power in Congress to one side or the other. Slaveholding states declared that Northerners were trying to end slavery. Northerners accused Southerners of plotting to extend the institution of slavery into new territories. And hostilities became so intense that people on both sides for the first time mentioned civil war and dissolution of the Union. These issues would come to light during this crisis that would foreshadow the war to come. The aging Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We have a wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go." Under the leadership of Henry Clay, Congress managed to temporarily resolve the crisis with a series of agreements collectively called the Missouri Compromise. In this compromise, Maine would be admitted as a free state, and Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, thus preserving the balance of power in Congress. The remainder of the Louisiana Territory would be split into two regions, one for slaveholders, the other for free settlers, along the 36-degree north latitude. South of this line, slavery was legal. North of the line, except for Missouri, slavery was banned. Jefferson feared for the Union's future after the Missouri Compromise, and his words would prove prophetic. President Monroe signed the Compromise of 1820, and the problem of slavery in the territories seemed settled for a generation. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, as delegates of their states, approved the Declaration of Independence, both would die. For years they had lived as rivals, but in old age actually had become the closest of friends. When Adams died around 5 p.m. on July 4th, 1826, he sighed, "At least I know that Thomas Jefferson lives on." Unbeknownst to Adams, Jefferson had passed away shortly before noon on that same day. When Adams died, his son, John Quincy Adams, was in the second year of his single term as president. He had succeeded James Monroe, but was unsuccessful in office due to his chief political opponent, Andrew Jackson. In the election of 1824, Jackson won the popular vote, but lacked the majority of electoral votes, and so the decision was sent to the House of Representatives to be settled. Because of his power as Speaker of the House, Henry Clay could swing the vote either way. Clay disliked Jackson personally and mistrusted his lack of political experience. So Adams was elected president, but Jackson and his followers accused Adams of stealing the office. During Adams' presidency, most states eased voting requirements, thus enlarging the voting population. Fewer states had property requirements for voting. So in the election of 1828, Jackson appealed to the common citizen, including many of the new voters, and characterized Adams as an intellectual elitist and portrayed himself as a man of humble origins, when in fact he was a wealthy plantation owner. So Jackson would win the election of 1828. Jackson instituted what became known as the spoils system, and he would say, "To the victor belong the spoils." Incoming officials throw out former appointees and replace them with their own friends. Jackson fired nearly 10% of the federal employees that were serving under Adams and gave those jobs to loyal Jacksonians. Jackson's closest friends became his advisors, and they would often enter the White House through the kitchen, thus becoming known as the kitchen cabinet. One of the hallmarks of Jackson's administration was the removal of Native Americans from their homelands. Since the 1600s, white settlers held one of two attitudes towards Native Americans. One was that they believed in displacement and dispossession of all Native Americans, or two, they wanted to convert Native Americans to Christianity and assimilate them into white culture. Since the end of the War of 1812, some southeastern tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, and Chickasaw, had begun to adopt the European culture of their white neighbors. These tribes became known as the five civilized tribes. The civilized tribes occupied large areas in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. But many white planters and miners wanted their land. Jackson did not believe assimilation would work. Allowing Native Americans to live on their native lands would have required too many troops to keep the areas free of white settlers. Jackson believed that the only solution was to move Native Americans from their native lands to areas further west. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and under this law, the federal government provided funds to negotiate treaties that would force the Native Americans to move west. About 90 treaties were signed. For Jackson, the removal policy was not only liberal, but generous, his words. But his arguments were mainly based on the rights of states to govern within their own boundaries. In 1830, Jackson pressured the Choctaw to sign a treaty that required them to move from Mississippi. In 1831, he ordered U.S. troops to forcibly remove the Sauk and the Fox from their lands in Illinois and Missouri. And in 1832, he forced the Chickasaw to leave their lands in Alabama and Mississippi. Meanwhile, the Cherokee Nation tried to win just treatment from the U.S. government through the U.S. legal system. Chief Justice John Marshall refused to rule on the first case the Cherokee brought against Georgia because, in his opinion, the Cherokee Nation had no federal standing. It was neither a foreign nation nor a state, but was instead a, quote, domestic dependent nation, end quote. The Cherokee teamed up with a missionary, Samuel Worcester, who had been jailed for teaching the Cherokee without a state license. The Cherokee knew that the court would have to recognize a citizen's right to be heard. So the case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the Cherokee Nation finally wins recognition as a distinct political community. The court ruled that Georgia was not entitled to regulate the Cherokee nor to invade their lands. Jackson refused to abide by the decision of the court, saying, quote, Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it, end quote. While Cherokee leader John Ross continued to fight the state in the courts, other Cherokees began to promote relocation. In 1835, federal agents encouraged a minority of Cherokees who favored relocation to sign the Treaty of New Echota. This treaty gave the last 8 million acres of Cherokee land to the federal government in exchange for approximately $5 million in land west of the Mississippi. With the signing of the treaty, the Cherokee exodus from Georgia began, but in 1838, nearly 20,000 Cherokee remained on their native lands in violation of the terms of the treaty. President Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor, ordered the Cherokee to be removed by force. U.S. troops under the command of General Winfield Scott rounded up the Cherokee and drove them into camps to await the journey. Beginning in October and November of 1838, the Cherokee were sent off in groups of 1,000 on the long journey. The 800-mile trip was made partly by steamboat and railroad, but mostly on foot. As the winter came on, more and more of the Cherokee died en route. Along the way, government officials stole the Cherokees' money, and outlaws made off with their livestock. More than 1/4 of those who began the journey died along the way. The route became known as the Trail of Tears. When the Cherokee reached their final destination, they found they had traded their native lands for lands which were far inferior. As we discussed earlier, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816 to protect the infant American industries from British manufacturers. The Tariff of 1816 was raised in 1824 and again in 1828. Jackson's Vice President, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, called the Tariff of 1828 a tariff of abominations. As an agricultural region dependent on cotton, the South had to compete in the world market. The high tariff on manufactured goods reduced British exports to the U.S. and forced the South to buy more expensive northern manufactured goods. From the South's point of view, the North was getting rich at the South's expense. Calhoun was in an unusual and politically dangerous position. He had long been known as a national spokesman and had supported the Tariff of 1816. He had served under both Adams and Jackson as vice president. But poor economic conditions in his home state of South Carolina caused him to change his point of view. Calhoun devised a nullification theory, which basically questioned the legality of applying some federal laws in foreign states. His argument was that the U.S. Constitution was based on a compact among the sovereign states, and if the Constitution had been established by 13 sovereign states, each state had the right to nullify a federal law that it considered unconstitutional. Calhoun also privately believed that if the federal government refused to permit a state to nullify a federal law, the state had the right to withdraw from the Union. The issue of states' rights was finally put to the test in 1832 when Congress passed another tariff that South Carolina legislators found unacceptable. They responded by declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 unauthorized by the Constitution and null and void and no law. Then they threatened to secede if customs officials tried to collect the duties. Jackson was furious. Although himself a Southerner and a slaveholder, he believed that South Carolina's actions were dangerous. He publicly declared South Carolina's actions treasonous and threatened to hang Calhoun and march federal troops into South Carolina to enforce the tariff. Jackson next convinced Congress to pass the Force Bill of 1833. This bill allowed the federal government to use the Army and Navy against South Carolina if state authorities resisted paying proper duties. A bloody confrontation seemed inevitable until Henry Clay again stepped in and proposed a tariff bill that would gradually lower duties over a 10-year period. So once again, Clay, who was known as the Great Compromiser, averted crisis. But the issue of federal authority versus states' rights would continue to be an issue throughout the 1840s and 1850s and would be a major cause of the Civil War that erupts in 1860.